welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by an extraordinarily prolific writer and a writer who has written a book that just kept me up all weekend. It is so much fun with such vivid world building and great characters, and I am so excited to get to it. So hello, welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, I'm Geneva Lee, and the book is called Filthy Rich Fae, and it's sort of a modern day take on Fae folklore set in New Orleans with mafia vibes.
That's a great elevator pitch. Like that is
Thank you. I literally just came up with it.
excellent. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your journey to this book, because this is a first in a spin-off series from another series which you did. So could you talk a little bit about that series and your decision to expand the world?
Well, it kind of started as I started writing this lore down for a magical world that was set within our own about, gosh, now it's been about 7 years ago. And I was just collecting little bits of lore, because I knew I wanted to write a vampire series. And so that turned into the Filthy Rich Vampires series, which that was actually a serialized book series that I did with Kindle Vella. And I'd always wanted to sort of test that out and test out vampires, but also try writing serial. I have degrees in 18th and 19th century English literature. So serial literature, of course, is something that I'm well familiar with. But I decided I was going to try vampires in that vein because I've been writing contemporary romance for a really long time. And my readers were a little like, we're not sure that we want anything magical from you, but I really wanted to write it. So it kind of just went from there. I started writing this vampires world, and originally it was conceived as sort of a Bridgerton with vampires set in modern day. I was watching Bridgerton and I thought, who would still do this? Who would still have a marriage mart and who would still have balls and go through all of the hoopla would be somebody like vampires, because of course they would have been alive hundreds of years ago and still clinging to tradition. And so that was the whole impetus for starting that series. And it was supposed to be 5 brothers and each of them would get a book. I don't know why I thought that I would do that, because I can't stand writing single books for characters. I have to write more than one book because I want to really develop the series out. And so that turned into 4 books for the main characters, and it will keep going with brothers. But the world just kept growing and growing. And I knew that, there are werewolves mentioned, there are witches mentioned. And I got a phone call from my editor, who was not my editor at the time. She was just a friend of mine. And she said, Filthy Rich Fae. I was like, what? She said, let's write Fae novels. And I was like, oh, we could do that. So with her help, I sort of built out this whole new Fae folklore into the existing world. So the world just keeps getting bigger and bigger. We keep calling it sexy Marvel-verse. It's just these characters with supernatural powers and all of these larger than life things happening to them. And I don't know, we have a whole lot of things planned. It will keep spinning into new creatures, new supernatural avenues.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think that a sexy Marvelverse is really apt, because the Marvel universe is decidedly unsexy. Like there's a lot of sex in it.
How is that possible? Chris Evans,
And it's a really rich world, and it feels like the lore feels lived in. So I'm actually like I'm very interested in your literature background. So when doing something, I guess, transitioning from a serial format into a standalone volume, was that a challenge, or were there new opportunities that presented themselves?
There were new opportunities. I think I think Filthy Rich Fae has a slightly different feel than Filthy Rich Vampires, which very much feels like you can feel the seasons of it. So I wrote the serial in seasons. So season 1, season 2, season 3, so on. And the books line up with those almost perfectly. We switched a few things around here or there so that it felt like some of my original cliffhangers between seasons, of course, were incredible. There was literally a cliffhanger at one point, and like an actual off a cliff. I was like, let's just go for it. So we did go in and like fluff those a little and make that kind of make sense. But we went in with, I mean, there have been so many editors on this project. We went in, we just kept developing it out and developing it out. The biggest difference between the serial version and the published version is there are more details in the published version. It's a little bit fuller. When you're writing for a serial format where it's coming out digitally, you know people are reading on their phones. And so you do tend to lend yourself to dialogue and action. And you keep those like descriptions and things just a little bit shorter. And so I had to go in and like add a little more nuance, just give that more layers, and then add a few scenes that I'd wanted to add in that just didn't really fit with that serial format, and spend more time in some of the magical places, which was a lot of fun.
Oh, nice. Wow. So when you are spinning off a series that's already has established a lot of the world and a lot of the setting, when you are approaching the first in a spin-off series, how do you balance the familiar with the novel? Like how do you balance what is familiar to the reader to kind of remind them about like the world that this is taking place in and what they've read in previous volumes, but also while making it unique and giving it its own sort of voice, if that makes sense?
It's a balancing act because you always have to assume that if someone's coming to a spinoff series, that they will not know all of the lore you've established in another series, if that's their entry point. And so it's always a tricky thing to kind of decide how much information you're going to give them, because on one hand, they can go and read the other series, and that's what you hope that they'll do, right? That they're going to go off and read the other series and get that full experience. But on the other hand, you have to give them enough so that they understand what's going on. It's a little bit easier with this because each of the series has a focal point of a particular sort of magical creature. I'm going to keep using the term creature. Where like vampires are really the heart of Filthy Rich Vampires, and Fae are really the heart of. And so even though you see these different supernatural creatures in all of the series, like you're learning the most about their individual histories and folklores and in those books. So what I always just think, you know, anytime you're writing any book, you have to decide how much of that, you know, the whole like everybody's seen the diagram of the iceberg where it's like this much is what the reader gets, and then down here is what the author knows about it, and that's something you always kind of struggle with. So it's like, how much do they need to know, and just organically planting that in when it's pertinent, so that if they need to understand that vampires wear gloves in this world and why, like, I'm not going to just drop that into Fae, right? Unless it's in the scene and they need to understand it. So I just try to treat them a little bit like it's their own story. And there's always, I think the easiest thing is there's always some character that is encountering this world for the first time, some human that is being dragged into this world. And so that always gives you the opportunity for exposition, right? Where it's like, what is this? And you can explain it to them because they're learning for the first time. But it is a balancing act of how much do I give, knowing that there's a 4-book series that's going to give you all the information on that. So it's something you're always just calculating and calibrating. And that's why you have an editorial team that comes in and goes, we don't need that much. and cut it out. So that always helps.
Nice. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about our sort of human initiate into this new world. Kate Holloway is our main character, and I was so impressed with like really the novel just is out the gate and starts running. Like there's not a lot of there's no lull, you know, before sort of action starts. Like we are there at the beginning, and it's very efficient. So could you talk a little bit about crafting Kate and her perspective on this world, as well as her relationship with Lachlan, because it's super interesting from the get-go. There's like a lot of energy there, and it's a very interesting dynamic.
It is, it's a great dynamic. It's a really fun dynamic to play with. It's interesting because I think that's one of those things where, um, thank God that the final novel came off that way, right? Because the actual writing process of Kate and Locke, because these are both individuals that are a little enigmatic, and they really both keep people at arm's length, and they have different reasons for that, but that's a trait that they both share. And I sort of subscribe to Norman Mailer calls it the spooky art. This idea that stories are kind of, and I'm just butchering, he would say this much more beautifully as we'll book on it. The idea that stories are out there in the ether and characters are out there in the ether, and we kind of like almost like divination, like put them into the world. It's spooky art. I can't explain it. I can't explain how the book comes out of me. But it was funny because when I started writing these characters, they didn't want to tell me anything about themselves. Usually what happens is a lot of times a book starts with either just a scene starts playing in my head and I'm like, oh, okay, let's see where this goes. Or a character walks into my head and they want to tell a story and we sit down and we start telling a story. I don't do a whole lot of manipulation on my end in terms of sitting down with character sheets and things like that and creating these characters. I kind of let them tell me who they are, and then I fill in little details that are important, you know, like nobody ever has an opinion on what their birthday is, so I get to decide that. But these characters just did not want to let me into their heads for a really, really, really long time. And I think I've spent more time at hotels writing this book than I've spent in any book, because I kept going away being like, I'll just devote all of my time and energy and all of my focus to them. And I had to write an entire draft where they were still a little bit nebulous. And it was like, that's when they started to trust me. And I realized this makes me sound like a crazy person, but it was just the way it was. And once they started to trust me, everything came together. And then the book was rewritten from every single line. So that they felt like, now that I knew who they were, I could write their story more efficiently. And a lot of the same plot points happened, but everything about how they experience the world, everything about how Kate experiences the world changes, because she has very good reason for being closed off. And I knew certain things about her backstories. That just was there and came to me. But how she experiences her own trauma was very unique. And so that was part of the trust sort of building with the characters. I really do sound like I'm should be seen by a doctor, but it's just the way it kind of worked out. But yeah, we went back in and we rewrote the whole thing. And I say we because it felt like the characters were in the room with me being like, okay, this is how I really feel about this. The one thing that was there, though, from the get-go was the dynamic between Kate and Locke, that they were just sort of like fire and water with each other. And so they were the one thing that showed up over and over, how they clash on the page, but also obviously have this like deep fascination with each other. You know, there's an attraction, obviously, but there's also, Kate is she's a sexual assault survivor, not giving anything away here. It's pretty much there from the beginning. And so she is very cautious with him. And yet at the same time, she's not cautious in the way you think she would be with someone that's running the underground of New Orleans. Like, this man could have me killed. And she's like, yeah, I'm going to speak to you like I would speak to any man that I feel has done something disrespectful to me or has put me in this position. And so I don't know, it's a very unusual dynamic, which I think by the end of the book, it becomes really clear like why it's this way for them. But I loved writing these characters. I'm super excited to keep writing in this particular storyline.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun. And I'm really kind of interested in how the dynamics that you're talking about play out through their banter. Like, oh, the banter is just like, mwah, like they're back and forth. And what was really interesting to me is that when you look at that through the lens of their like defensiveness and their sort of reluctance to engage, like that banter can have like an interesting push-pull where sometimes they're using it to get closer and sometimes they're using it to put a barrier up, and there's a lot of really interesting sort of like a cool dance of intimacy happening through their dialogue that way. As you were talking about before, you love cliffhangers, you are known for them, and this one has a doozy of one. When you're crafting cliffhangers, does that become more does it become harder as you become known for them? Is there pressure to sort of outdo yourself or to, like how do you keep that fresh for yourself?
Um, I'm literally looking at a little plaque on my desk right now that a reader had made for me that says Geneva Lee, Queen of Cliffhangers. It sits in front of my computer. It's interesting because it has strange consequences. There's the consequence of like, there are people that will not start reading the series because they know it. So as you become known for cliffhangers, there are people that are waiting until book 3 to even start reading. And that can be a little disheartening as an author for sure. But yeah, there's really no pressure to outdo myself. And the reason that there's no pressure to outdo myself is that the cliffhangers come very organically to me. So it just feels naturally that this is where it ends and that this is the moment, since I'm writing in a series, where bam, this is where we're going to stop. And it's funny because I feel like with Faye in particular, we did a really fantastic job of like softening the cliffhanger. Like it feels like a really complete story, and then everything is set up for book 2. And so to me, it feels like a very soft cliffhanger. And reviews are starting to come in. They're like, cliffhanger. And I'm like, it's not even one of my worst ones. I've left people shot and dying before. People have been, I mean, all sorts of terrible things have been happening to characters in my books. I think this comes from being a child of the 80s and 90s when the way you kept your TV show on air, because they never knew if they were going to cancel it until all the ratings were in, right, was to have like this massive cliffhanger like Dynasty in Dallas. And this is a throwback. Sliders had a really bad cliffhanger one year. But yeah, where you were just on the edge of your seat for months writing literally letter campaigns to the studio saying, don't cancel the show. You have to come back. I have to know what's going to happen. And so that was just storytelling in my mind. But they always sort of happen organically at a point where it feels like everything is going to shift into a new aspect of the story, a new plot line, some new thread. Something has been resolved, but a new one is opening up. So I don't think I've ever faced a gosh, what can I do for this cliffhanger? Which is fortunate because like you said, I've written like 38 books. I don't know. Every once in a while I try to count them up in my head. Something along those lines. And I am known for them for better or for worse. The thing I will always warn people, so if you're new to me, is there will eventually be a happily ever after. I call these romance novels. I know there are some people that would say this isn't romance because they're not holding hands at the end of this book. And I'm just saying that generally in any of my books, but there will be a happy ending eventually. They just got to fight for it a little.
Nice. And it's sweeter when it's hard won, so
Yeah.
wow. Well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. This book was really so much fun, and I love the insight into your process. I know we just talked about cliffhangers, and so we don't want to give too much away, but what is on the horizon for you? Are you working on the next one already, or what
Oh
is
yeah, I am mid-draft of the second book because that book is currently slated to come out at the beginning of 2025. We'll see. That can always shift, just happens. But I'm working on that one, and there's at least 3 books in this series. I always say at least, and whatever number we've planned, because sometimes I thought there were going to be 3 books in the original arc of Filthy Rich Vampire, and it needed 4. So who knows? But then I know we're doing other spinoffs in the world, and I'm dabbling with going back and doing a second gen of my Royal Saga, which is a contemporary. And I mean, I'm always working on something new, some new plot, always plotting something.
Well, that's great. Well, good luck. I cannot wait to read the next in this, and I can't wait to see, the other directions in which this world expands. Thank you.
Thank you.
Listeners, it's your turn. Please check out Filthy Rich Fae. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So pick it up at your favorite library or bookstore, wherever you like to go for those things. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.